The snow fell in thick, heavy blankets, turning the frozen landscape into a dull, lifeless white. The cold in Bastogne was like a second enemy, one that gnawed at your bones, slowed your thoughts, and froze your resolve. For Corporal Wilhelm Adler of the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, it was just another day in a campaign that had become a grinding, desperate struggle. The German forces had encircled Bastogne, a vital crossroads town in the Ardennes, as part of their push during the Battle of the Bulge. The surprise German offensive, designed to split the Allies and capture key positions, had thrown the American forces into disarray. But the Americans, as always, refused to surrender. Adler's division had been assigned to cut off the town, and his men had spent days digging into the snow and ice, preparing for an assault on the town itself. The streets were eerily quiet, broken only by the occasional distant artillery shell and the muffled footsteps of soldiers making their rounds. "We'll break them," Adler thought to himself. "We just need to wait for the right moment. The snow will work in our favor. Our tanks will smash through." But there was something unsettling in the air, something beyond the freezing temperatures and the deepening winter. It was the tension, the feeling that something wasn't right. It wasn't just the weather or the heavy fog of war. It was the knowledge that the Americans in Bastogne were a force unlike any he had ever faced. The command came unexpectedly, like a gust of icy wind. The American 101st Airborne Division, trapped in the town, had been sent a message from the German commanders: one last chance to surrender. The Germans, confident of victory, had sent their ultimatum, a demand for unconditional surrender. It was said that German officers had expected a swift reply, perhaps fear, perhaps hesitation, anything that would indicate the Americans knew they were on the verge of defeat. The response, however, was something Adler would never forget. The Americans, holed up in their defenses, responded simply with one word: nuts. The German officers, baffled, had demanded an explanation. What did the Americans mean? Was it a coded message? A trick? But there was no mistaking it. This was the answer. The American soldiers, trapped in the snow, surrounded on all sides, had refused to back down. The word nuts wasn't just a reply. It was a declaration. That night, Adler stood with his comrades in the bitter cold, hearing the laughter and disbelief echo through the trenches. Some of his men were puzzled by the response. Others were frustrated, even angry. How could anyone be so defiant, especially in the face of total destruction? Damn Americans, they just don't know when to quit. Adler couldn't shake the feeling that this was something different. The Americans had done more than refuse to surrender. They had turned their rejection into a symbol of defiance. Nuts wasn't just an insult, it was a challenge. The days that followed were filled with relentless fighting. The Germans pushed forward, determined to break the American defenses. The American 101st Airborne Division held firm, refusing to give an inch. The town of Bastogne became a symbol of stubborn resistance, where American soldiers fought not just for survival, but for the belief that they would eventually break the German siege. But as the days stretched on and the cold intensified, the Germans began to realize the cost of their offensive. Supplies were running low, morale was starting to crack, and the weather, once an advantage, was becoming a barrier to their own movements. The Germans, well versed in the tactics of rapid movement and encirclement, were now stuck in a quagmire while the Americans dug in. Adler's division, now fully entrenched, could hear the sounds of American artillery echoing through the frozen trees. The fire was relentless, shaking the earth beneath their feet. Their tanks, once so sure of their dominance, now struggled to move through the deepening snow, their tracks frozen solid. In the silence that followed each barrage, Adler couldn't help but think about the Americans. Their tanks, their soldiers. How did they keep going? How did they keep fighting even when everything seemed lost?
Then came the unexpected, Patton's tanks. Adler had heard rumors about Patton's forces breaking through the lines, about American reinforcements pushing through the snow, but like many of his comrades, he had dismissed it as more Allied propaganda. No one could break through the German defenses, not this far into the encirclement. But then, one morning, the ground began to shake. The rumbling of engines was faint at first, like the distant growl of thunder, but it grew louder, closer, until it became unmistakable. The sound of tanks. Adler turned to his comrades, their faces marked with exhaustion and fear. They had been fighting for days without rest, their bodies growing weaker, their spirits even more so. They had come so close to victory, only to hear the unmistakable sound of American tanks, roaring through the snow like a beast awakening from a long slumber. The American tanks, patrolling the snow-covered landscape like an unstoppable juggernaut, broke through the German lines. They were tanks, yes, but they were more than that. They were a symbol of everything the Germans had underestimated: the relentless American industrial might, the spirit of the men who fought, and the sheer willpower that had driven them to survive. Adler's division, already stretched thin and running out of resources, was forced to pull back. The Nuts reply had proved prophetic. American grit, determination, and the unstoppable tide of reinforcements had turned the tide. The Germans, who had once thought themselves invincible, now found themselves outgunned, outmaneuvered, and outlasted. As the American tanks broke through the snow, the Germans were forced to retreat. Their defensive lines crumbled like paper, disintegrating under the weight of the American tanks. The roar of the engines, the thunderous fire of the guns, it was deafening. Adler and his comrades, once so sure of their victory, now found themselves scrambling to maintain any semblance of order. The shock of the American breakthrough was like nothing he had ever witnessed. In the chaos, as his division pulled back, Adler caught a glimpse of a few American soldiers, young men, faces covered in the dirt and snow, still holding their ground. They weren't fighting for victory, but for survival. They weren't giving up. They weren't giving in. They were simply doing what they had always done, fighting with everything they had. In that moment, Adler understood. It wasn't about the tanks or the weapons. It was about something much deeper, something that no amount of fuel or ammunition could match. The Americans had something his division didn't: the resolve to keep fighting, no matter the odds. The Battle of Bastogne marked the beginning of the end for the German forces in the Ardennes. As the American tanks continued to break through, Adler and his men were forced to retreat further into the freezing landscape. The relentless American push had shattered their lines and their morale. For Adler, the sound of the American tanks would forever echo in his mind. It wasn't just the roar of the engines, it was the sound of defeat, the sound of a war that Germany could no longer win. In the days that followed, as the German forces withdrew, Adler would reflect on that moment, when he first heard the tanks, when he realized that the Americans weren't just fighting for a foothold in Bastogne, they were fighting to win. And in that fight, they had something the Germans had lost: hope. The Americans had hope, and with it, they had power.
Years later, Adler would look back on the Battle of Bastogne as one of the defining moments of his life. He had been there, in the snow, surrounded by the weight of the past, but it was the American tanks, Patton's forces, that had driven the point home. The war was changing, and Germany was losing. It wasn't just a loss of territory, it was a loss of spirit, of will. The Americans, against all odds, had proved that their determination, their resources, and their resolve could overcome anything.
As he sat quietly in his post-war home, surrounded by the memories of a life he could never return to, Adler realized that the war wasn't won on the battlefield. It was won by those who never gave up, who kept pushing forward no matter the cost. The "nuts" reply had become a symbol of that defiance, a symbol that no matter how bleak the situation, no matter how impossible the odds, the Americans had a strength that could never be broken. Adler couldn't help but smile despite the bitterness of his memories. He had lost the war, but in some strange way he had gained a deeper respect for the very enemy he had once fought so fiercely against. The Battle of Bastogne was a turning point in the war, but for Dietrich Adler, it had become a symbol of something greater, of survival, of resilience, and of the unbreakable spirit of the American soldier. In the snow and the bloodshed, the Americans had proven something that the Germans had failed to recognize. The fight was never about who had the best tanks, the most fuel, or the best trained soldiers. It was about who could stand firm when everything else was falling apart. As Adler reflected on that battle, he understood that the war had not been lost in the snow, in the mud, or in the rubble. It had been lost the moment the Germans underestimated the spirit of the American soldier. The years that followed the war were long, and for Dietrich Adler, they were filled with a quiet, constant struggle to reconcile his past actions with the man he had become. The war had left scars not just on the land, but on the hearts of those who had fought in it. Even now, as he lived a civilian life far from the battlefield, those scars never fully healed. Adler had spent some time in the Soviet occupation zone after the war, but eventually he found his way back to West Germany, where life had slowly started to rebuild. The American influence was heavy, and though many Germans still held animosities toward their former foes, the sheer scale of the rebuilding effort in the West made it impossible to ignore the lessons in resilience, industriousness, and innovation that had come from the American side.
There were days when Dietrich sat alone in his modest apartment in Dusseldorf, staring out the window at the changing landscape of a post-war Germany. He watched the hustle of the city's workers, the rapid pace at which Germany was beginning to prosper once again. It was so different from the stark, broken country he had come home to in 1945. But no matter how hard he tried, Adler couldn't shake the image of the American tanks cutting through the snow at Bastogne, the sound of their engines reverberating in his chest like a thunderclap. The war had changed everything. The old ideals of honor, bravery, and nationalism that had once driven him had evaporated into the smoke of battlefields. And in their place, Adler found himself facing an uncomfortable truth. Maybe this had never been about right and wrong at all. It had been about resources, willpower, and sheer momentum. The American tanks had become the metaphor for that momentum, unstoppable, relentless, and efficient. One day, as Adler sat in a quiet cafe in Dusseldorf, sipping his coffee, a thought struck him. Could there have been another way? He wasn't sure what prompted the thought, but it had been growing inside him for a while. During the war, the narrative had always been that Germany was defending itself, fighting for the survival of its people and its ideals. But in hindsight, as he sat in the warmth of a peaceful post-war world, the war seemed less about survival and more about the blind ambition of a few powerful men who had led the country into a devastating conflict. He remembered the nights in the trenches, the long stretches of waiting between the assaults, the ever-present fear that each day could be his last. At the time, it had been easy to convince himself that he was fighting for something meaningful, something larger than himself. But now, looking back on it, it seemed like a distant, almost foolish belief. The cost of those ideals, thousands upon thousands of lives lost, including his own comrades, some of whom had become like family to him, had been too high. And for what? Adler's mind wandered back to the battlefields of Bastogne, where the American soldiers had faced almost certain destruction, only to turn the tide through sheer determination and unity. Their ability to hold the line against the Germans, despite being surrounded, despite the harshest conditions, had left an indelible mark on Adler. And there was something else, something Adler had come to realize over the years. The Americans, despite being the enemy, had taught him more about perseverance than any of the German generals or officers ever had. The Americans had understood the essence of survival. They understood that the war wasn't just about defeating the enemy. It was about maintaining your will to fight, no matter how dire the circumstances. As time went on, Dietrich Adler found himself drawn to the people who had once been his enemies. He worked with a few former American soldiers who had come to Germany as part of the post-war reconstruction efforts. They didn't speak much about the war, but there was an unspoken understanding between them. They had both been soldiers. They had both fought in battles that in hindsight seemed meaningless. But despite the past, there was no animosity between them. They were simply people trying to rebuild their lives, to find new purpose in a world that had been torn apart by war. Adler had often wondered how his American counterparts viewed the war, especially the Battle of Bastogne. Did they see it as a defining moment too, or was it just another chapter in a larger conflict? One of the American workers, John, who had been a young tank commander during the war, shared a quiet conversation with Adler one afternoon. "You know," John began, his voice low, "I've thought about Bastogne a lot. We were stuck in that town, surrounded, freezing in the snow, but we never gave up. Never. Even when everything seemed lost, we kept fighting. And when those tanks broke through, man, it felt like a miracle." Adler looked up, surprised by the vulnerability in John's voice. He had never expected to hear such emotion from an American who had been involved in such brutal combat. "It must have been something," Dietrich replied, pausing before he spoke again. "For us, we thought we had the upper hand. But when I think back on it, when I think of the Americans, all I can say is, your tanks, they were unstoppable." John chuckled softly. "We had our fair share of struggles too, Dietrich. But I think what made us unstoppable wasn't just the tanks. It was the men inside them, the belief that if we held together, we could make it through." The conversation drifted into silence as both men absorbed the weight of their words. It was strange to think of their shared past as enemies now being reflected upon with mutual respect. The war, for all its brutality, had shaped both their lives in ways they hadn't fully understood until now. The true lesson, it seemed, wasn't about who won or lost. It was about the strength of the human spirit, the ability to endure, to push through the worst of times.
Had been involved in such brutal combat. "It must have been something," Dietrich replied, pausing before he spoke again. "For us, we thought we had the upper hand. But when I think back on it, when I think of the Americans, all I can say is, your tanks, they were unstoppable." John chuckled softly. "We had our fair share of struggles too, Dietrich. But I think what made us unstoppable wasn't just the tanks. It was the men inside them. The belief that if we held together, we could make it through." Dietrich Adler would eventually retire, finding work as a mechanic, a simple job that allowed him to focus on his craft and escape the ghosts of the past. The reconstruction of Germany continued at a rapid pace, aided in no small part by the Marshall Plan and the rebuilding efforts spearheaded by the Americans. The country was rising again, but the scars of the war were still deeply etched in the hearts and minds of those who had lived through it. For Dietrich, the war would always be a part of him. He couldn't erase it. He couldn't forget the horrors he had seen, the men he had lost. But as time went on, he found a quiet peace in the ordinary life he had built for himself. He married, raised a family, and lived the best he could in a world that had changed beyond recognition. But even as the years passed, there were moments, small moments, when the memories of the war would come flooding back. The faces of the men he had fought beside, the faces of those he had lost. And in those moments, Dietrich would remember Bastogne, remember the Americans, and remember that one word: nuts. It wasn't just a word. It was a defiant challenge. A challenge that the Americans had answered, not with a single attack, but with everything they had, with their strength, their unity, and their resolve. In the end, Dietrich knew that the war had been lost in the cold snow of Bastogne. But it was there, amidst the rubble and the broken lines, that he learned something important, something he would carry with him for the rest of his life. It's not the weapons you carry that make you strong. It's the will to keep fighting, even when all seems lost. And as he looked out across the peaceful streets of post-war Germany, he realized that perhaps, after all, the real victory wasn't just about surviving the war. It was about finding the strength to move forward, to rebuild, and to never give up, no matter what. As the years stretched on, Dietrich Adler found a form of peace in the quiet monotony of everyday life. Germany was slowly rebuilding, its scars still visible, but healing with time. The bombed-out ruins of the once mighty Reichstag were now distant memories, replaced by new structures, modern infrastructure, and an emerging sense of hope. The people were starting to look forward to the future, but Dietrich knew the past was never far away, especially when it came to the memories of the war. Each day, he worked as a mechanic in a small repair shop, fixing everything from old Volkswagens to large farm equipment. It was a humble existence, but one that allowed him to focus on something tangible, something that required his full attention and skill. There was no room for thoughts of the battlefield or the horrors of war when he was under a car, his hands deep in grease, making sure the engine purred to life once again. It gave him respite, something that could numb the ache in his chest, even if just for a moment. But Dietrich knew that no amount of work could fully escape the past. Every now and then he'd catch himself staring at a piece of machinery, his thoughts drifting back to the tanks that he had once seen on the battlefield. American tanks, their engines roaring like thunder, shaking the very ground beneath him.
It was a late afternoon, the golden light of sunset casting long shadows through the repair shop, when Dietrich received an unexpected visitor. The man at the door was familiar, a former American soldier, John, the same soldier with whom he had shared that moment of quiet reflection years earlier. John had returned to Germany several times since the war, but their meetings had always been brief and filled with awkward silences. But this time it was different. John was no longer the young tank commander Dietrich had faced across the enemy lines. Time had worn down his youthful optimism, replaced by the same weariness Dietrich had come to know all too well. "Mind if I come in?" John asked, his voice carrying a quiet sense of nostalgia. "We need to talk." Dietrich nodded, gesturing to a seat. "Of course. It's been a long time." The two men sat across from each other, the years between them evident in their silence. Neither of them knew where to start. Finally, John broke the silence. "I was thinking about the war, about everything we did, about you." His words hung in the air, fragile and uncertain. Dietrich met his gaze. "I'm sure you've been thinking about it a lot too. We all have. I can't speak for you, but it feels like something that never really goes away. I wake up some days and it's like I'm still there, still fighting." John let out a long breath, looking down at his hands. "I don't know about you, but I've had a hard time letting go of it all. Sometimes I wonder if we really fought for the right reasons.
I thought we were fighting for freedom, for justice. But looking back, it feels different now." Dietrich leaned forward slightly, his voice soft but steady. "The war changed all of us. Some of us lost more than others. But we fought for what we believed in, just like you did. We both did. But now it's about finding a way to live with what we've done, with what we've lost." John nodded, his eyes filled with a quiet sadness. "That's the hardest part, isn't it? Moving on after it all. There's no real answer for any of it. We all did things we'll never be able to take back." The silence between them deepened. It was an unspoken understanding, a bond forged not in the heat of battle, but in the quiet aftermath, where the ghosts of the past lingered, waiting to be acknowledged. Over the next few weeks, John returned to Germany several times, and each visit was marked by long conversations, each man searching for something within himself. They would talk about the war, but also about their lives after it. Dietrich shared stories of his family, his work, his attempts to rebuild his shattered existence. John spoke of his life back in America, his struggles to reintegrate into a civilian life after the chaos of combat. For Dietrich, these conversations were more than just a chance to catch up. They were a form of therapy, a way to finally confront the reality of what had happened, not just during the war, but in the years that followed. He had spent so long suppressing the memories, burying them beneath the layers of his daily life, that he had almost forgotten how to process them. But talking with John, sharing those moments of vulnerability, brought clarity. It was a painful, slow process, but it was one that Dietrich needed. John, for his part, was just as changed by these conversations. For years he had carried the weight of the war with him, an invisible burden that no one seemed to understand. His comrades, his family, even his friends, none of them could grasp what he had lived through, what he had seen. But Dietrich, a man who had fought on the other side, could. He could understand the weight of loss, the frustration of surviving when so many others did not. And for that, John was grateful.
One cold evening in January, after another long day of work at the shop, Dietrich and John sat in the back, sipping beer. The fire in the small stove crackled, and the glow from the embers cast a warm light across the room. For the first time in a long while, Dietrich felt at ease, truly at ease. The war had taken so much from him, but in this quiet moment, he could feel the smallest of reconciliations taking place. "Do you ever regret it?" John asked suddenly, his voice low, almost hesitant. "Regret being there, on that side? I know I regretted being on mine." Dietrich looked at him, considering the question. "I don't know if I regret it. I was a soldier, John. I did what I thought was right. But now I see things differently. The war, well, it wasn't about good versus evil. It was about survival, and in some ways, we were all just trying to survive." John smiled faintly. "Yeah, that sounds about right." There was a long pause, the weight of their words settling between them. Dietrich took a deep breath. "But I do regret the lives that were lost. I regret that so many of my friends never made it out of that hell. And I regret that we never really had a chance to understand each other until it was too late." John nodded, his eyes dark with the same understanding. "We were all just pawns, weren't we? Stuck in a game we didn't choose." Dietrich glanced down at his beer. "We were pawns, but we're still here. And I think that's what matters. That we're here, and that we're trying to move forward." As time passed, Dietrich's life began to change. The conversations with John, the quiet reflection on his past,
and the slow process of rebuilding his life began to have a profound effect on him. The war was never far from his mind, but now it no longer controlled him. He was able to face it, to accept it, and slowly he started to understand that healing wasn't about forgetting. It was about learning to live with the scars. His relationship with John, once tentative and awkward, deepened into a quiet friendship. They would continue to meet, share stories, and reflect on the war. Sometimes they would laugh, other times they would sit in silence, both of them lost in thought. But it was these moments, these small, shared silences, that Dietrich came to value most. One day, as they sat on a bench overlooking the Rhine River, Dietrich turned to John. "You know, John, I think we finally understand each other." John smiled. "I think we do." And in that moment, Dietrich realized that perhaps that was the greatest victory of all. Not the battles fought, not the wars won or lost, but the understanding that had grown between them. The simple human connection that had survived the destruction of war. Years passed, and the war became a distant memory for many, but for Dietrich, it remained a constant companion. He never fully escaped it, but he had learned to live with it. The man that he had been, the soldier who had once fought for a cause that now seemed meaningless, was gone. In his place stood a man who would come to understand the true cost of war, not just in terms of lives lost, but in the destruction of innocence, of ideals, and of the very soul of humanity. Dietrich Adler would live the rest of his days in Germany, working, raising a family, and living a life that was quiet but meaningful. He would never forget the lessons of the past, but he would also never let them define him. For in the end, it wasn't the war that defined Dietrich Adler, it was the choices he made afterward, the willingness to move forward, and the understanding that even in the darkest of times, there could still be hope.
By the time Dietrich reached his late 50s, much had changed in both his life and Germany. The once shattered nation had slowly rebuilt itself, transitioning from the ashes of war into a modern society, eager to join the world again. Dietrich had married, had children, and worked hard to carve out a life that was, in many ways, the antithesis of the one he had known during the war. Yet, for all the progress, he knew that healing was an ongoing process. The scars, both visible and invisible, remained. It was a sunny afternoon when he received an invitation that would alter the course of his life once again. It came in the form of a letter from the American government, an official correspondence bearing the seals of post-war Germany's integration into the international community. The letter was an invitation to participate in a veterans reunion, a gathering of men who had fought on opposite sides of the war, Americans, Germans, British, each with their own story, their own history of loss and survival. Dietrich had never considered attending such an event. He had moved on, or so he thought. The past was a painful chapter, one that he had closed long ago. Yet there was something in the tone of the letter, something about the possibility of seeing his old adversaries face to face that stirred something deep within him, a longing, perhaps, for closure. The thought of standing in the same room with men who had once been his enemies was unsettling. Could they ever truly understand what he had been through? Could he understand them? Was it even possible to bridge the chasm that had been carved by the war? He sat at his kitchen table, the letter in front of him, and thought of John. How many years had passed since they had last sat together, talking about the war and its lasting effects on their lives? John had invited him to America once, suggesting that they visit some of the battlefields together. But Dietrich had always refused. The distance, both physical and emotional, was too great. But this invitation, this felt different.
Dietrich's decision to attend the veterans' reunion was not made lightly. For days he pondered it, discussing it with his wife, who, though understanding of his hesitance, encouraged him to go. "You've lived with this for so long, Dietrich. Maybe it's time you met the other side, finally put it all to rest." So, with a mix of fear and curiosity, Dietrich packed his bags, left his family behind, and traveled to the United States. The journey itself was long and exhausting, but it gave him time to reflect. What was he hoping to find? What kind of answers was he searching for in this meeting of former soldiers? He had no idea. All he knew was that he had to face his past, head on, and see if it was possible to find some semblance of peace in a world that had been forever altered by the war. When he arrived at the reunion venue in a quiet American town, the nerves set in. It was a modest hotel, but the sense of history in the air was palpable. The lobby was filled with veterans, their faces weathered by time, their eyes tired but sharp, each man carrying his own memories of the past. Some of them looked at Dietrich with quiet recognition, others with skepticism. For a moment he wondered if he had made a mistake. But then he saw him. John. John had already spotted him, and his face broke into a smile, wide and welcoming, as if the years had melted away between them, and they were just two men again, struggling to make sense of their shared history. "Wilhelm," John said, walking toward him with a firm handshake. "It's been a long time, my friend." Dietrich smiled back, feeling the weight of the moment settle in. "Yes, it has, John. A very long time." The two men spent the rest of the evening catching up, but the real breakthrough came the next day, when the veterans were gathered in a large hall. The event was simple, an opportunity for men from both sides of the war to share their experiences, to talk openly about what they had seen, what they had lost, and what they had learned.
When it was his turn to speak, Dietrich stood up, his legs a little unsteady as he faced the room of strangers and former enemies. His heart raced, and he could feel the sweat gathering at his palms. This was it, the moment where he would finally confront everything. "I fought for Germany," Dietrich began, his voice low but steady. "I believed in the cause. I believed in the fight. But when I look back on it now, I see how misguided we were. The war, it consumed us all. But it didn't just consume us, it consumed everyone around us. The people, the families, the lives we took, none of it was worth it. None of it." He paused for a moment, his eyes scanning the room. There were men here who had fought against him, men who had lost brothers, sons, friends in the same battlefields Dietrich had fought on. But in their eyes he saw no hatred. There was only understanding. "I spent years hating the war," Dietrich continued, his voice cracking slightly, "hating myself. But I've learned that the real enemy wasn't the other side. It was the war itself. It's the lies we were fed, the ideologies that divided us. And now all we have left are the memories of what we did, of the people we lost, and of the price we paid. And the hardest part is knowing that we'll never get those years back." There was silence in the room as Dietrich's words hung in the air. Slowly, one by one, the man around him nodded, understanding more than he could have ever imagined. John stood up next, placing a hand on Dietrich's shoulder. "We were all just soldiers, Dietrich. We didn't ask for any of it, and we all paid the price." And in that moment, Dietrich understood. They had all paid the price. The cost of war was never fully realized until the battle was over, and it was only in the quiet aftermath that men could begin to understand the true costs.
The reunion continued for several days, but it was these moments of shared reflection that Dietrich would carry with him for the rest of his life. The walls that had once divided him from his former enemies slowly crumbled, and in their place there was an understanding that, despite everything, they were all part of the same human story. As Dietrich left the reunion and returned to Germany, he found himself changed. He no longer carried the burden of guilt that had weighed him down for so many years. He had finally reconciled with the past, not by forgetting it, but by understanding it. And he knew that while the war would never fully leave him, it no longer defined who he was. Germany was still rebuilding, still recovering from the scars of war, but Dietrich had learned that recovery, much like healing, took time. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew this: he was no longer just a man defined by his past. He was a man who had learned to move forward, to live with the weight of his history, and to share that understanding with those who had once been his enemies.
As Dietrich settled back into his life in Germany, he began to focus more on his family. His children, who had always known him as a quiet, hard-working man, were now old enough to ask questions about the past. For the first time, Dietrich felt ready to answer them, not just as a father, but as a man who had faced the darkest parts of history and had come through the other side. One evening, as they sat around the dinner table, his eldest son asked him what it had been like to fight in the war. "It was hell," Dietrich replied simply, but there was no bitterness in his voice. "But it was also something that shaped who I am today. The war taught me many things, things I would never want anyone to experience. But if there's one thing I learned, it's that we must never stop trying to understand each other. That's the only way to prevent it from happening again." His son listened intently, his eyes wide with curiosity. "Do you think the war was worth it?" Dietrich thought for a long moment before answering, his voice steady but full of emotion. "No, son. No war is ever worth it. But understanding what we did and learning from it, that is worth everything, so that we don't make the same mistakes." As the years went on, Dietrich found peace in the quiet moments of his life. He continued to work as a mechanic, helping his children with their education, and participating in local events that celebrated the new era of peace. But in the back of his mind, he never forgot the lessons of the past, the lessons of Bastogne, of the tanks, of the "nuts" reply, and of the soldiers who, despite being enemies, had come together to understand each other. In the end, Dietrich realized that it wasn't the battles won or lost that mattered. It was the moments of connection, the moments of understanding, that shaped the true course of history. And that was something that no amount of tanks, no amount of gunfire, could ever take away.